Today, we're diving into the history of Finland. It's an incredible story, really, a tale of a nation forged between giant empires, and it's one of the great survival stories of modern history.
So how did they do it? How did a nation constantly caught in the middle become one of the world's most stable democracies? Well, their story is just this amazing masterclass in survival and adaptation. It's all about forging a unique identity against, frankly, incredible odds. So we're going to break it down into 5 key parts. We'll start with its ancient roots as this contested borderland. Then we'll look at 6 centuries under Sweden, a surprising awakening under the Russian Tsar, the absolute trial by fire of the 20th century, and finally, how Finland went from neutrality to joining NATO.
Okay, so let's rewind the clock, way back. We're talking over 10,000 years ago. The last ice age is ending, the glaciers are melting, and what's left behind is this rugged new land. The very first people who set foot here were true pioneers, settling in a place that would, for centuries, become a crossroads and, you guessed it, a battleground for giants. For literally thousands of years, before anyone was even thinking about drawing borders, this land was home to hunter-gatherers and traders. And you can see this slow, steady evolution. First, pottery shows up, kicking off the Stone Age. Then comes the Bronze Age and the Iron Age. And even way back then, you can see this geographic tug-of-war starting. You've got influences from Scandinavia on one side and Russia on the other, a constant theme in Finland's story.
And get this wasn't just about basic survival. Not at all. We found evidence of a surprisingly advanced early society. I mean, archaeologists have dug up the world's oldest fishing net right here. Plus, you've got this really distinctive pottery and these mysterious massive stone structures they call giants' churches. We're still not totally sure what they were for. So we're not talking about scattered tribes. These were innovative communities already laying a deep cultural foundation.
All right, let's fast forward a bit. Now we're getting into the era where Finland's fate gets tied up with its powerful neighbor to the west, Sweden. And this is a really important point. For over 600 years, Finland wasn't just a colony. It was an integral part of the Swedish kingdom. This period is going to shape everything: its laws, its religion, its entire social structure. It all really kicks off in the 12th and 13th centuries with the Northern Crusades. But think of this less as a simple conquest and more as a deep cultural and political merger. This is the moment that really locks Finland in as the eastern edge of the Western world, the ultimate borderland between Catholic Sweden and Orthodox Russia.
So under Swedish rule, you start to see the building blocks of a modern state falling into place. Finns get representation in the Swedish parliament, Lutheranism becomes the main religion, they even get their first university. But here's what might be the biggest game changer of all, the Reformation. A bishop named Mikael Agricola translates the New Testament into Finnish, and that single act, that creates the foundation for a written Finnish language. It gave a voice to a culture that until then had mostly been passed down through stories and songs.
Okay, now for a massive plot twist. It's 1809. There's a war, and Sweden is forced to hand Finland over to Russia. Now, you'd think this would be a story of oppression, right? But it turned into something completely different. It became this paradoxical era of incredible autonomy, which actually led to the birth of a powerful Finnish national identity.
And this is really the great paradox of Finnish history. You see, when they were part of Sweden, Finnish culture was always kind of second fiddle. But under the Russian Tsar, Finland becomes an autonomous Grand Duchy. The Tsar lets them keep their old Swedish laws, and, this is the crucial part, he actually encourages the Finnish language. So why would he do that? Well, it was a pretty clever strategic move. By building up a distinct Finnish identity, he could cut their old ties and loyalties to Sweden. Russia's strategy, believe it or not, accidentally planted the seeds for Finland's eventual independence.
So, what was the spark for this national awakening? It was culture. You had this whole movement of intellectuals and artists who started digging into and celebrating Finland's unique heritage, all the stories and myths that had been passed down for centuries. And all this work led to the creation of one of the most important books in Finnish history.
There was this one scholar, Elias Lenrot, who spent years just traveling the countryside, writing down all these ancient folk poems and myths. Then, in 1835, he put them all together into one single national epic called the Kalevala. And this book, it was an absolute revelation. It gave the Finnish people a heroic past, a shared mythology. It inspired a whole generation of artists like the famous composer Jean Sibelius. It was proof that Finnish was a language of art and literature, not just for farmers in the countryside.
All right, now we hit the 20th century, and everything gets thrown into the fire. That cultural awakening we just talked about, that laid the groundwork. But Finland's real nationhood, its very survival, would be forged in war. It was a brutal, defining time when the country had to fight for its life, first against itself and then against a massive superpower. So, the Russian Empire collapses in 1917 and Finland sees its chance. It declares independence. But freedom, it was anything but easy. The country immediately falls into a devastating civil war, the Reds versus the Whites. And just as they're starting to pick up the pieces, an even bigger threat looms, a massive invasion by the Soviet Union in what's known as the Winter War. That was followed by the Continuation War, where Finland fought like hell to get back the territory it had lost.
The human cost of these wars against the Soviet Union was just staggering. Almost 100,000 Finns lost their lives.
To put that in perspective, that's 2.5% of the entire population, an almost unimaginable price to pay. And yet, somehow, against all odds, Finland held on. It preserved its independence and remained a democracy, which was, an incredibly rare thing for a country right on the Soviet Union's doorstep.
So, after the absolute trauma of World War II, Finland finds itself in a new, very dangerous world. The Cold War is kicking off, and their survival is now all about walking this incredibly fine line, a delicate balancing act between the West on one side and the massive Soviet Union breathing down their necks on the other.
This unique strategy actually got its own name, Finlandization. You could call it a policy of pragmatic neutrality. What did it mean in practice? Well, Finland got to stay a free, capitalist democracy, but it had to be extremely careful not to annoy its superpower neighbor. This sometimes meant things like self-censorship in the news or taking really cautious positions in the UN, all just to keep the peace.
This whole complex relationship was spelled out in a treaty in 1948. It put real limits on Finland's military and its foreign policy. But, and this is so important, it also guaranteed Finland's right to be a democracy with a capitalist economy. It was this careful, clever diplomacy that allowed Finland to escape the fate of the Eastern Bloc countries and instead build a thriving, Nordic-style welfare state, all while living in the shadow of the Iron Curtain.
For decades, this idea of being militarily non-aligned was just part of the Finnish identity. Public support for joining NATO, it was always super low, like maybe 25%. Then, February 2022 happened. Russia's invasion of Ukraine changed everything, almost overnight. That historical threat suddenly felt very, very real again, and public opinion just did a complete 180.
And so, in a move that would have been unthinkable just a year earlier, Finland abandoned decades of neutrality. On April 4, 2023, it became the 31st member of NATO. The entire era of Finlandization was officially over. A brand new chapter had begun in this long, long story of resilience. When you look back, Finland's story is just this powerful reminder of how a nation's destiny is shaped by geography, by culture, and maybe most of all, by an incredible knack for strategic adaptation. From a contested borderland to a committed member of an alliance, it really makes you wonder, what will the next chapter of Finland's history of resilience look like? Hey, if you enjoyed this explainer, we've got a whole Quick Country Histories playlist you should definitely check out. And for more deep dives like this, make sure you subscribe to Notebook Summaries. Thanks so much for watching.